In this video, the last one for this unit, we're going to discuss how you can use congruent triangles in order to show that line segments are congruent and to show that angles are congruent. And in order to do this, we're going to recall something that we learned way back at the beginning of the unit. When we first started talking about congruent triangles, we said that whenever two triangles were congruent, all of their corresponding sides were congruent, and all of their corresponding angles are congruent. Now, in order to use this, we must have congruent triangles first. So it's important to remember that in order to use this in a proof, we also have to have congruent triangles first. So I'm going to make a little note here. We must have congruent triangles in order to use this fact. And that's going to be very important to pay attention to as we work through the proofs in this section. We always have to have congruent triangles before we can say that their corresponding sides or their corresponding angles are congruent. Now, if we take a look at the first proof, immediately the fact that jumps out at me is the fact that instead of trying to prove congruent triangles, we're trying to prove congruent angles. Now, that said, if we go back to that key idea that I just emphasized, we need to have congruent triangles first. So my objective in starting this proof is going to be to show that we have congruent triangles. So just as we've done throughout this unit, my mission or my goal at the start of this proof is going to be to prove that we have congruent triangles. So like always, I'm going to go ahead and mark the givens in my picture. If segment BD bisects angle ABC is that green angle at the top of the triangle. So the two congruent angles are going to be the two that I just marked in green. Segment DB bisects angle ADC at the bottom of the triangle. So my two congruent angles are going to be those that I just marked in purple at the bottom. And if I'm thinking that I want to show that these two triangles are congruent, I notice that they share side BD right up the middle. So the method of proving these triangles congruent that's jumping out at me is angle sine angle. I'm going to write in my proof about angle 1 being congruent to angle 2. I'm going to write in my proof about side BD being congruent to side BD. And I'm going to write in my proof about those two angles down at the bottom. I'm going to name them 3 and 4 are congruent to each other. So now, and only now that I have this outline done, only now am I going to go ahead and start my proof. And again, my mission is to prove that these triangles are congruent first. All right, so somewhere I want to write about these angles 1 and 2 being congruent. I knew they were congruent because of this angle bisector. So I'm going to have a discussion about the angle bisector first. And because of that angle bisector, I know that those two angles at the top of my picture are congruent to each other. The next thing I want to discuss in my proof is this pair of congruent sides, BD congruent to itself by the reflexive property. And then lastly, I want to have a discussion about angles 3 and 4 being congruent. And I knew they were congruent because of the purple angle at the bottom of the picture that was being bisected. So now that I've talked about my two pairs of congruent angles within those triangles, my pair of congruent sides within the triangles, I'm all set to pull these guys together, and I know the triangles themselves are congruent. Now, it's very important in these types of proofs that when you're naming the triangles, that you match up the pairs of congruent corresponding parts. So if I call the triangle on the left triangle BAD, then when I name the triangle on the right, I want to make sure that the very first vertex I name is the one that corresponds to angle B in the triangle on the left. So that's going to be angle B. I want to make sure that the second vertex that I name is the one that matches up with angle A. So C will match up with angle A, and then lastly D will match up with itself. And these two triangles were congruent because of angle side angle. And as a last step, now that I know these triangles are congruent, I know that all their corresponding parts, all their corresponding sides, and all their corresponding angles are also congruent. But the pair that I'm trying to prove congruent are angles A and C. So my last step in writing this proof is to go ahead and make or draw the conclusion that angles A and C have to be congruent to each other. And as for a reason for that, I can say congruent triangles have congruent corresponding parts. Now, if you're like me and you would like to use an acronym, kind of a shortcut, you can use the acronym Cpctc. And that means corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And I might write that out one time and one time only. So however you're comfortable saying, you can say congruent triangles have congruent corresponding parts, or you can use the acronym Cpctc. A big key idea here, though, is that you must prove these triangles congruent first. You cannot, may not, will not use Cpctc until you've written about congruent triangles in your proof. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. The next one says segments AB and CD bisect each other at point E. So in other words, that means segment AB cuts segment CD into two equal pieces, and segment CD cuts segment AB into two equal pieces. All right, so I've got those two pairs of congruent sides, and looking at the diagram, I see the pair of vertical angles at E. So now I'm thinking about proving these triangles congruent using side angle side. So I've got CE congruent to ED. I've got the vertical angles at point E. And the second pair of sides, side AE congruent to side EB. So again, I know that it says prove these angles congruent to each other, but at this point, my first goal, my first objective is to make the triangles congruent. So that's where I'm going to go first. For all you two-column lovers, this one's for you. I'm going to go ahead and write my statement and reason proof. If you're a two-column person, make sure that you label your statements and reasons, and make sure you number them. So first thing I want to talk about is this pair of congruent sides. I knew they were congruent because of the fact that segments AB and CD bisect one another. I know that's a true statement because it's given to us to be a true statement. And from that segment bisector, I actually know a couple different pairs of segments. I know CE and ED are congruent. And at the same time, I also know that segments AE and EB are congruent. And that's because a segment bisector makes, forms, creates, however you want to say it. And I had the segment bisector in statement 1, so I want to cite statement 1. So at this point, I'm feeling pretty good because I've already discussed two of the 3 pairs of congruent parts that I need in order to prove these triangles congruent. The 3rd pair of parts is pretty simple to get to. Angles 1 and 2 are congruent due to the fact that they're vertical angles, and vertical angles are always congruent. So now when I name my triangles, I have to be very careful. I'm going to name the first one triangle CEA. Naming the first one, you don't have to be so careful, but naming the second, you do. The angle in the second triangle that corresponds with angle C is going to be the one that's attached to the blue side, but not to the green. So this angle D is going to correspond to angle C. The vertical angles at E are going to correspond. And lastly, angle A in the triangle on the left is going to correspond with angle B in the triangle on the right. So again, the way in which you name these guys, very important. So this was side angle side using statements 2 and 3. And lastly, now that I've got these triangles congruent, I know that all their corresponding parts, all their corresponding sides, and all their corresponding angles have to be congruent. The pair that I'm particularly focused on, because it's what I'm being asked to prove, are these angles C and D. So I know that angles C and D are congruent. And as for my reason, I can either say when 2 triangles are congruent, all of their corresponding parts are congruent, or I can just use that acronym. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And I'm going to cite statement 4 because statement 4 was the statement where I was talking or referencing those congruent triangles. All right, so this is a great video, chock full of important ideas. Should give you quite a lot to summarize as far as key understandings and important takeaways. Once you've done that, see what you can do with those proofs on this very last page in your yellow notes packet.